The doctors called it organ failure. I called it murder. The room smelled wrong. Not like death, everyone in the Kang estate already expected death. The lead physician had delivered his verdict 40 minutes ago, in clipped, clinical Korean, multi-system failure, advanced stage, 5 days at the outside. Minjun had stood at the foot of his mother's bed like a man carved from black granite. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around him. A tattoo crept up the left side of his neck, a thin crosshatch scar bisecting it like a signature from a world most people never survived entering. He hadn't blinked, hadn't moved. His jaw was set so tight you could see the muscle jumping beneath his cheek. Beside him, Ji-hai wept beautifully. She always wept beautifully. Silk blouse, pearls at her collarbone. One manicured hand pressed to her lips, as though the grief were too large to contain. Her eyes were wet, but her mascara was perfect. It had been perfect through 3 doctor visits, 2 emergency consultations, and 1 very expensive second opinion that said exactly the same thing as the first. Elizabeth Darwin noticed things like that. She noticed them from the corner of the room, where she moved her mop in slow, careful arcs across marble that didn't need cleaning. Elizabeth was 29 years old, with close-cropped natural hair pinned beneath a white domestic's cap, dark skin warm against the stark navy and white of her uniform. Her apron was pressed. Her shoes were silent. She had perfected the particular art of being invisible, the slight forward tilt of the shoulders, the downcast eyes, the practiced rhythm of someone the room had already forgotten. But her nose never lied. Beneath the medicinal sting of the 4 drips, beneath Ji-hai's expensive perfume, beneath the chrysanthemums dying slowly in their vase by the window, there it was. Faint, metallic, threaded with something bitter and ancient, like iron left too long in wet earth. Ambw. Elizabeth's hand tightened on the mop handle. She knew that smell. Her grandmother had taught her to recognize it before she was old enough to read, pressing her small face into jars of dried roots and bark in a house that smelled permanently of wood smoke and green things. This one will make you well. This one will make you sleep. This one, her grandmother's voice had dropped to something solemn. This one has no business in a well woman's body. Ambw. A slow toxin. Patient as hatred. Untraceable by every test modern medicine bothered to run. The doctors hadn't smelled it. They had charted declining organ function and called it natural. They had given Madame Kong 5 days and written their condolences in careful, professional language. Elizabeth gave her exactly 120 hours. But not to die. To be saved. She wrung the mop into the bucket and kept her eyes on the floor as the doctors filed out, as Ji-hai laid a gentle hand on Minjun's arm and murmured something low and consoling into his shoulder. As Minjun stared at his mother's face with an expression that wasn't grief. Not quite. It was something colder. More calculating. The face of a man who was deciding something. Elizabeth had learned, in the 18 months she had worked in this estate, that Minjun Kong was not a man who accepted what he was told. He ran the most feared criminal organization in Seoul with the kind of controlled ferocity that made other men cross streets to avoid him. He did not accept outcomes. He engineered them. Which meant if Elizabeth was going to save his mother, she needed to do it before he engineered one of his own, and before the woman still weeping silk tears in the corner noticed that the maid had stopped cleaning. She lifted her eyes. Just for a moment. Ji-hai's gaze slid across the room like water finding a drain, and for 1/2 second, it landed on Elizabeth. Not the bored, imperious sweep of an employer noticing the help. Something sharper. Something that measured and filed away. She knows I'm here, Elizabeth thought. She's wondering how long I've been here. Elizabeth looked back down at the floor. 120 hours. A poison that wasn't supposed to have an antidote. A killer in silk, standing 3 feet from her next victim. And a maid with her grandmother's secrets and absolutely nothing left to lose. The doctors left at 7:30. Elizabeth heard them go. The soft, diplomatic shuffle of expensive shoes against marble, the careful click of the front door closing on 5 days and no hope. She had been in Madame Kang's room the entire time. Invisible in her corner. Learning things. She learned that the lead physician, Dr. Yoon, had the defeated eyes of a man who had already written his report in his head before he opened his bag. She learned that Madame Kang's fingernails had taken on the particular gray-yellow tinge that GM produced in its third week of administration, not sudden enough to alarm, gradual enough to look like the body simply surrendering. She learned that Jihai knew exactly when to place her hand on Minjun's forearm. Not when the worst news landed. A half-second after. Precise as a metronome. The way you'd rehearse a gesture until it looked like instinct. And she learned that the smell was strongest near the water carafe on the bedside table. Not the tea. Not the medication. The water. Elizabeth filed every detail behind her eyes and kept moving her mop. Minjun hadn't spoken since the doctors left. He stood with his back to the window, the Seoul skyline pressing up cold and electric behind him, tower blocks stacked against a sky that couldn't decide between night and rain. He was looking at his mother's face with the kind of focus that had nothing peaceful in it. Madame Kang lay small against her white pillows, her silver hair fanned out around her, her breathing shallow but rhythmic. She had been a formidable woman. Elizabeth had seen her reduce a room full of suited men to careful silence with a single raised eyebrow. Now she looked like something being slowly erased. Which was, Elizabeth understood, precisely the point. Jihai dabbed at the corner of her eye and leaned her head gently against her husband's shoulder. "We should let her rest," she murmured. "There's nothing more we can do tonight." Minjun said nothing, but he let himself be guided out. Elizabeth waited until the door clicked shut. Then she crossed to the bedside table, uncapped the water carafe, and lowered her face over the mouth of it. There it was. Cold and bitter and almost imperceptible, buried under the mineral flatness of filtered water. Metallic at the back of the throat, with that distinctive finish her grandmother had called the taste of slow patience. Jeomdok didn't announce itself. That was its elegance and its cruelty. It accumulated in the organs like sediment at the bottom of a river. Invisible until the damage was permanent. Undetectable until the body had already decided to fail. Elizabeth straightened and looked at Madame Kang's face. "I hear you," she said quietly. To the sleeping woman, and to her own grandmother both. She replaced the carafe exactly as she'd found it. And went back to her mop. The estate went quiet by 1 in the morning. Elizabeth knew its rhythms the way she knew her own heartbeat, which guards rotated at the eastern corridor at midnight, which hallway light flickered for 3 seconds before catching, which floorboard outside the kitchen exhaled under pressure and had to be stepped over. Not on. 18 months of invisibility had made her fluent in this house's secret language. She waited until 3 a.m. Her room in the servants' quarters was small and smelled of cedar and industrial soap. She kept her grandmother's supplies in a locked tin beneath the floorboard under her bed, not because she had planned to need them here, but because she never went anywhere without them. 14 small pouches of dried material. 3 glass vials. A folded piece of oilskin covered in her grandmother's handwriting, in a language Elizabeth was the last person living who could read. She laid them out on her blanket in the dark and worked by touch and memory. The first purge couldn't be aggressive. Jeomdok resisted rapid removal, push it too fast, and the body's response was worse than the poison itself. Her grandmother had been clear, you coax it out like a splinter. Not yank it like a weed. Elizabeth ground 2 measures of dried wangi root, 1 of dansam, a pinch of charcoal blackened chonggung bark that she'd sourced from a market in Itaewon 3 months ago, without knowing why, only that her hands had reached for it. And her grandmother had always said her hands knew things before her mind caught up. She brewed it cold, the way it had to be done, filtering it twice through the oilskin until the liquid ran clear and almost odorless. Then she decanted it into a plain water bottle, tucked it under her arm, and moved into the dark. The Eastern Guard changed at 3. The window between his departure and his replacement's arrival was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Elizabeth had counted it 7 times over 5 months, always thinking she was counting for no particular reason. She slipped into Madame Kang's room without a sound. The woman's breathing was labored in the small hours, her chest working harder than it should for rest. Elizabeth moved to the bedside, lifted the real water carafe and replaced it with one she'd filled from the tap and doctored with a single drop of flavorless tincture, enough to ease Madame Kong toward deep sleep without alarming her system. Then she drew the oilskin beside the bed and worked quickly. She pressed 2 fingers to the inside of Madame Kang's wrist, reading the pulse the way her grandmother had taught her, not just the speed, but the character of it. The places where it stuttered, where it went thin. 3 weeks of poisoning. Maybe 4. Longer than I thought. She's stronger than she looks. Elizabeth uncapped the purge solution and lifted Madame Kang's head with one hand, gentle as handling something she was not willing to break. I know you can't hear me, she whispered in the dark. But I need you to swallow. She administered the dose in 4 small measures, waiting between each one. On the 3rd, Madame Kang's throat moved instinctively. On the 4th, her brow shifted, just slightly, and then smoothed. Elizabeth replaced the carafe, adjusted the pillow, stood for one moment with her hand resting over Madame Kang's, and listened to the breathing slow into something less desperate. Then she gathered her things and was gone before the guard's footsteps returned to the corridor. By the morning of the 2nd day, Madame Kang's color had changed. Not dramatically. Not enough for the attending nurse to note in her chart. Not enough for the household staff, who had begun moving with the hushed efficiency of people preparing for a funeral, to look twice. But Elizabeth noticed. The gray-yellow had retreated slightly from her fingernails. Her lips held a shade more pink. When the nurse lifted her wrist for the morning vitals, Madame Kang's pulse tapped back with just a fraction more insistence. Jihai noticed too. Elizabeth was changing the flowers by the window when she saw it, Jihai standing in the doorway of the sick room, watching the nurse record her readings, her expression arranged in the correct configuration of loving concern. But her eyes were doing something different. They moved over the room the way water moves over a surface looking for somewhere to seep through: the medication table, the water carafe, the bedside tray, the flowers, the window, and then, finally slowly, to Elizabeth. Elizabeth stripped a dead stem from the arrangement and dropped it in the refuse bin. Jihai said nothing. She smiled at the nurse, asked 2 soft questions about her mother-in-law's comfort, and withdrew. That afternoon, Elizabeth came back from collecting the linens to find her room searched. Not ransacked, nothing so obvious. But the cedar box on her shelf had been moved 2 inches to the left. The fold of her spare uniform was wrong. The corner of her mattress had been lifted and replaced with a precision that was almost insulting in how carefully it tried to mimic her own. Elizabeth stood in the center of her room for a long moment. Then she took the tin from beneath the floorboard, wrapped it in a cloth, and relocated it to a place no one would think to look, behind the loose brick at the base of the garden wall, where she'd noticed the mortar crumbling 6 months ago and had, until now, simply left it. She went back to work. Jihai wanted her gone. That was fine. Wanting and managing were 2 different problems, and Jihai didn't yet know exactly what she was dealing with. By the time she figured it out, Elizabeth intended to be finished. 3 more nights. 3 more doses. And then something else, something Jihai's own hands had already made inevitable. She was in the kitchen at 6 the next morning, working the 2nd purge compound into a paste that would dissolve into broth, when she heard him. Not footsteps. Minjun didn't announce himself with footsteps. She simply looked up, and he was there. Filling the kitchen doorway in black, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving over the workbench with the slow, systematic attention of a man who catalogued everything and forgot nothing. The neck tattoo caught the morning light. Up close, Elizabeth could see now that it wasn't abstract, it was a date, worked into the crosshatch lines. Something personal and permanent. He looked like he hadn't slept. The kitchen staff don't start until 7, he said. Not an accusation. An observation. I know, Elizabeth said. She didn't look away from the paste she was working. I like the quiet. What is that? Barley and ginger. For my stomach. He crossed the kitchen without invitation and stopped on the other side of the workbench, 2 feet from her hands. This close, he was larger than he appeared from across a room. Not just in height, but in the particular gravity of him. The sense that the air around him rearranged itself according to his preferences. My mother's pulse was stronger this morning, he said. Elizabeth said nothing. Dr. Yoon said that sometimes happens before the final decline. His voice carried no emotion. But his eyes were doing something different from his voice. He called it a rally. Dr. Yoon, Elizabeth said carefully, is looking for organ failure because that's what he was told to look for. The kitchen went very still. Minjun's eyes moved to her face with a precision that made her scalp prickle. What did you say? Elizabeth set down her pestle. She had rehearsed this moment and decided, somewhere between the second guard rotation and the first gray light coming through her window, that there was only one way to say what needed to be said. Directly. Without softening. The way her grandmother had always delivered hard truths. Your mother isn't dying, she said. She's being erased. The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind. The kind that didn't push back because it was deciding something. Explain that. His voice was very quiet. The water carafe on her bedside table. Every morning, every night. Whoever refills it is adding something to it, something that doesn't show in the tests they're running because they're not running the right tests. It accumulates. It looks like systemic failure. Elizabeth held his gaze. It's called ambw. It's old. It's patient. And it has an antidote. But only if you start before the 5th day. You're a maid, he said. I'm my grandmother's granddaughter, she said. And she knew things that didn't come from medical school. Another silence. Elizabeth watched something move through him, not disbelief, which surprised her. Something more complex. Something that looked, from the outside, like a man hearing words that confirmed a thought he had not yet been willing to finish thinking. How long have you known? Since the doctors were here. And you said nothing to me. I said something to your mother first. She couldn't hear me yet. I'm saying something to you now. She looked at him steadily. I need 3 more nights in that room. I need you to say nothing, change nothing, and keep everyone away from that carafe until I tell you otherwise. Minjun looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Elizabeth felt the particular exposed sensation of being genuinely seen by someone who rarely looked at anything without wanting something from it. If you're lying to me, he said softly, or if this is some play I don't understand yet, then your mother dies in 4 days, exactly as the doctors predicted, Elizabeth said, and you'll know I was wrong. But you already know I'm not. She picked up her pestle and went back to work. After a moment, she heard him leave. The blue stain root grew only in one place on the estate grounds, a northern wedge of the garden that backed against the perimeter wall, overgrown and deliberately neglected, where the soil held enough iron and moisture to sustain what most people dismissed as a common weed. Elizabeth had spotted it her first month here and had never touched it. Had simply noted it the way her grandmother had taught her to note everything that grew. File it away, child. You never know what the world will ask of you. She needed it now. Not for the purge, that work was nearly done. Madame King's body was responding better than Elizabeth had dared hope, her color returning like a tide coming in. The blue stain root was for what came after the healing, for the evidence that would make undeniable what Elizabeth had already proved. She went at 11 on the 4th night. The garden at that hour was silver and shadow, the sole towers pressing orange light into the sky above the walls, low enough to navigate by. She moved along the garden's eastern edge with her collecting cloth, keeping to the darkness beneath the hedges, and had almost reached the northern wedge when she heard them. 2 of them. Men who moved like soldiers, which meant Jihai's private staff. Not the Kang family guards, who Elizabeth knew and could predict, but the 2 Jihai had quietly introduced into the household 3 months ago, under the title of personal security. Elizabeth had watched them from the beginning. She had watched the way they watched everything that moved near Jihai's interests. She flattened against the garden wall and went completely still. One of them swept a low-powered torch along the garden beds, not searching for intruders. Searching for something specific. His beam moved over the northern wedge, paused, moved on. The second man spoke quietly into a radio. Elizabeth couldn't hear the words, but she heard the tone, the checked, efficient tone of people reporting that a situation was contained. She sent them to pull it, Elizabeth understood in a cold flash. She knows what it's for. She knows more than I gave her credit for. The torch beam completed its sweep and the two men moved back toward the estate. Elizabeth waited, pressed against the cold brick, counting her own breathing, until their footsteps faded completely. Then she looked at the northern bed. The blue stain root was still there. Most of it. They had harvested several stalks, enough to deprive her if she'd arrived 10 minutes later. But Jihai's men had taken only what they could see from standing height. Elizabeth dropped to her knees in the dark, pressed her fingers through the soil at the base of the remaining plants, and worked by feel, the way her grandmother had shown her. The root is not the flower, child. And the flower is not the root. What you need is always deeper than what they can see. She gathered what she needed into her cloth, packed the soil back carefully, and was back inside the servants' entrance in 6 minutes. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. Jihai now knew she was being outmaneuvered. That changed the timetable. What had been a quiet race was now something else, something faster, more open, and considerably more dangerous. 1 night left. 1 final dose. And then the reagent. And then the kind of truth that stained your hands the color of exposure, whether you wanted it to or not. Elizabeth washed the soil from her fingers, laid her materials out in order, and got to work. She found the jewelry at noon. A bracelet and 2 rings, laid with deliberate casualness beneath the folded corner of her mattress, not hidden, exactly, but placed at the precise depth that suggested concealment by someone who didn't know the hiding spots well enough to be convincing. Elizabeth recognized the pieces. She had seen them on Jihai's wrist at dinner 3 weeks ago. Pale jade set in white gold. The kind of jewelry that had provenance and paperwork, and a value that would end a servant's life in this country before she finished explaining herself. She didn't touch them. She stood at the foot of her bed for exactly 10 seconds, memorizing the placement, the angle, the small theatrical fold of the mattress corner that was meant to look like her own careless concealment. Then she walked out of her room, down the back corridor, and into the kitchen to begin the morning's work, as though she had seen nothing at all. Jihai moved at 2 o'clock. Elizabeth was carrying a tray of folded linens past the main staircase when she heard the lady of the house in the upper corridor, her voice carrying the particular pitch of a woman performing distress for an audience she had already assembled. 2 of the household staff. The senior steward, Mr. Beck, who had served the Kang family for 19 years and ran the estate with the quiet authority of a man who had outlasted everything thrown at it. And Minjun, who must have been sent for, because he appeared at the top of the stairs with the contained, dangerous stillness of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of a thought he wasn't finished with. I didn't want to say anything, Jihai was saying, her voice low and controlled in the way that projected maximum credibility. I kept hoping I was mistaken. But my grandmother's bracelet, the jade set, I had them appraised last month, you remember, I mentioned it at dinner. I remember, Minjun said. They're gone. And I've asked Mrs. Seo, and she hasn't seen them, and I've checked everywhere they should be, and a careful pause, the breath of a woman reluctant to say the next thing. I don't want to make accusations. But there's a girl on the domestic staff who has been behaving strangely. Going through the garden at unusual hours. Spending time in your mother's room without being asked. The silence from the top of the stairs had weight. Elizabeth set her linens down on the side table, smoothed the top sheet once, and walked upstairs. She stopped 3 steps below the landing, where all of them could see her clearly, and looked at Jihai with the same calm she used when she was reading a pulse. My room is unlocked, she said. It always is. Mr. Beck has a master key. If the lady's jewelry is there, it will take less than a minute to confirm it. Jihai's expression didn't change. But something behind her eyes did, a fractional recalculation. The recognition that the script had been acknowledged rather than interrupted. She turned to Minjun with her grief reassembled. I'm sure there's an explanation. Minjun looked at Elizabeth. Not the way he'd looked at her in the kitchen. This was the full, measuring weight of a man whose judgment had never been wrong about threats and who was deciding, in real time, which category she occupied. Go, he said to Mr. Beck. They found the jewelry exactly where it had been placed. Mr. Beck held the pieces in his palm and presented them to Minjun with the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere else. The 2 household staff stood in the doorway with their eyes on the floor. Ji-hai stood slightly behind her husband's left shoulder, and Elizabeth watched the particular quality of her stillness. Not the stillness of a woman waiting for justice. The stillness of a woman watching a mechanism she had built perform exactly as designed. "I think," Ji-hai said softly, "we should call the police." "No." The word came out of Minjun before anyone else could breathe. He turned the bracelet over in his hand once, then set it on the dresser with a precision that made the small sound of gold on wood feel like a full stop. "Sir," Mr. Beck said carefully, "the evidence was placed there." Minjun looked at Elizabeth. "How long?" "Since this morning," she said. "I found them at noon." "And you left them?" "I left them." He studied her face with that unnerving focus. "Why?" "Because moving them would have looked like guilt. And because I didn't have time." She held his gaze. "I still don't. Tonight is the 5th night. I need access to your mother's room by 11, and I need that corridor empty of everyone who isn't you." Ji-hai made a small, precise sound, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief. Something calibrated to suggest that a maid asking for unsupervised access to the sick room on the final night of a dying woman's life was so far past reason that it barely warranted a response. "Minjun," she said. "Listen to what she's saying." "I am," he said. He was still looking at Elizabeth. "I've been listening to her longer than you know." The silence that followed was a different kind than the ones before it. This one had an edge. Ji-hai's posture didn't shift. But her hands, pressed neatly together at her waist, tightened once. "If something happens to your mother tonight," she said, her voice dropping to something almost tender, "and this woman has been alone with her, with no witnesses, no oversight. The responsibility for that will fall somewhere. You understand that?" "I understand a great many things," Minjun said. He picked up the jade bracelet and held it out to his wife. "Your grandmother's pieces. You'll want to keep them safe." Ji-hai took the bracelet. Her fingers closed around it. Her face remained perfect. 11 o'clock, Minjun said to Elizabeth. "The corridor will be clear." Elizabeth nodded once and went back to her linens. She spent the hours between dinner and 11 in her room, working the final compound with the kind of concentrated quiet her grandmother had called listening with your hands. The last purge dose was the most complex, not in its preparation, which she had rehearsed until it lived in her fingers, but in its precision. Too little, and the final traces of ambw would linger. Too much, and she'd be fighting the body's own overcorrection through the night. She worked by the light of a single lamp, measuring and remeasuring, and when the compound was done, she set it aside and began the second preparation. The blue stain reagent. It was not, technically, a medicine. It had no healing property whatsoever. What it had was a particular chemical affinity for the residue that ambw left on the skin of whoever handled it, a compound that persisted on the hands for up to 72 hours. Invisible to the naked eye. Inert, odorless, and patient as everything its host toxin was. The blue stain root, reduced and combined with 2 other compounds from Elizabeth's tin, produced a reagent that reacted to that residue on contact. It turned the skin blue. Bright. Indelible. Unambiguous blue. Her grandmother had developed it not as a forensic tool, but as a safety measure, a way for healers to confirm which plants they'd been handling in the dark, when memory and touch weren't sufficient. It had never occurred to her grandmother that it might one day be used to prove a murder. It had occurred to Elizabeth. She decanted the reagent into a small glass bottle and labeled it in her own shorthand. Then she laid out both preparations, closed her eyes for 30 seconds, and reviewed the plan with the same methodical attention she gave to everything she couldn't afford to get wrong. At 5 minutes to 11, she gathered her materials and moved. The corridor was empty. Not approximately empty, genuinely, completely clear. The way it only happened when someone with absolute authority over the household had made it so. The night nurse's station was dark. The guard post at the end of the hall was vacant. Elizabeth moved through the silence with her cloth bag against her chest and let herself into Madame Kang's room without a sound. She was 15 minutes into the final administration. The purge dose working its last careful passage through a body that was, she could feel it in the pulse, in the quality of the breathing, in the temperature of the skin at the wrist, fighting its way back. with a stubbornness that felt deeply personal. When the door opened behind her, she had known it would. She had, in fact, counted on it. Ji-hai moved into the room with the silence of someone who had been practicing this particular entrance for days. She was dressed simply. Dark clothes, hair pulled back, no jewelry. In her right hand she carried a syringe, and she held it with the ease of someone who had held one before, who had not needed to look up a dosage or rehearse the action. She took 2 steps toward the bed, and then registered Elizabeth standing between her and her mother-in-law. And stopped. The 2 women looked at each other in the dark. "Move away from the bed," Ji-hai said. Her voice was completely calm. "No," Elizabeth said. Ji-hai tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they encounter an obstacle they hadn't assigned enough significance to. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand exactly what's at stake," Elizabeth said. "You've spent 4 weeks poisoning a woman, so she couldn't rewrite her will before she decided her son's marriage wasn't worth preserving. You've been meticulous and patient and very nearly perfect. The only thing you didn't account for was the smell." Something moved across Ji-hai's face. Not guilt. Annoyance. "The dose in that syringe will stop her heart," Elizabeth continued. "It will look like the natural conclusion of organ failure. Dr. Yoon will sign the certificate, everyone will grieve appropriately, and in 8 months when the estate transfers, you'll be precisely where you intended to be." She watched Ji-hai's hand tighten around the syringe. But her pulse this morning was 62. Her color is back. Her kidneys are processing normally for the first time in a month. She is not dying of organ failure anymore. Which means if her heart stops tonight, the story has a problem. Ji-hai moved. She was faster than Elizabeth had anticipated, crossing the space between them with the decisive momentum of a woman who had already decided that whatever stood between her and that bed was a problem to be removed. She caught Elizabeth by the shoulder and drove her back against the wall with enough force to knock the breath out of her. And Elizabeth let herself be driven, but in the half-second of contact, she pressed the glass bottle of reagent into Ji-hai's free hand and closed Ji-hai's fingers around it. Ji-hai felt the wet of it. Looked down instinctively. "What is?" The door opened. Min-jun filled the frame. Behind him, 2 of his men. And behind them, Mr. Beck. With the expression of a man recording everything for future testimony. Ji-hai straightened. She still held the syringe. Her other hand was closed around the reagent bottle, and Elizabeth watched the calculation happen behind her eyes, the instant construction of an alternative narrative. A maid producing an unlabeled substance. A syringe that could be explained as medication. A wife who had come to check on her mother-in-law in the night and found. "She attacked me," Ji-hai said, turning to Min-jun. "She had something in her hand. I don't know what it is, and she—" "Open your hand," Elizabeth said. Ji-hai's mouth closed. "The bottle I put in your hand," Elizabeth said, "contains a reagent that reacts to the residue ambw leaves on skin. It's on your hands right now. It's been on your hands for 4 weeks. Open your hand and we'll all see it." The room held its breath. Ji-hai looked at her husband. Her expression moved through several configurations in rapid succession: indignation, injury, the particular sorrow of a woman falsely accused, and Min-jun watched all of them with eyes that had gone very still and very dark. The eyes of a man who had been waiting for something to confirm itself. "Ji-hai," he said quietly. "Open your hand." She didn't move. "Ji-hai." The reagent bottle fell from her fingers as she released it, and Min-jun looked at her palm. The blue had already begun. Bright and chemical and unmistakable, blooming along the lines of her fingers where the reagent had made contact with what lived there, the invisible residue of 4 weeks of careful, patient, daily administration. It spread slowly across her skin like ink through water, climbing toward her wrist, finding the traces she had washed away but never quite erased. Because ambw left its mark on its handler as certainly as it left its mark on its victim. Ji-hai stared at her own hand. Min-jun looked at it for a long time. Elizabeth watched him absorb it, not with surprise, she noticed, but with the particular quality of a grief that had been held at arm's length finally arriving. She thought of what he'd said in the kitchen. "She's stronger than she looks." He had been talking about his mother. But she wondered now how long he had been watching his wife and thinking the same thing in a different register. "Get her out of this room," he said to his men. His voice was very quiet. "Put her somewhere she can't leave." Ji-hai found her voice. "Min-jun, you're going to believe a maid over your own. Take the syringe," he said to Mr. Beck. "Have it tested by morning." Mr. Beck took it. Ji-hai's voice lifted, sharpened, began constructing arguments, and then Min-jun turned and looked at her. And whatever she saw in his face dissolved the words before they reached her mouth. The men guided her out of the room. The door closed behind them. Min-jun stood in the resulting silence. He looked at his mother, who had slept through all of it, her chest rising and falling with the deep, untroubled rhythm of a body that had decided, against every medical prediction, to continue. Then he looked at Elizabeth. "She's going to recover," Elizabeth said. "Fully, if she rests. Her body has done most of the work." She began repacking her cloth bag. "She'll be confused when she wakes. Tired. She should drink the broth I'll prepare in the morning, nothing else until the afternoon." "How long have you known it was Ji-hai?" "I knew it was someone in this house from the first night. I knew it was someone with daily access to the water carafe by the second. I knew it was her by the third, when she searched my room." Elizabeth fastened the bag. "Someone with nothing to hide doesn't search the maid's quarters." Min-jun was quiet for a moment. "I suspected her," he said. "For weeks. There was nothing I could point to. Nothing that would hold inside the organization without starting something I couldn't control." "I know," Elizabeth said. "That's why you let me work." He looked at her, not the evaluating look from the kitchen, not the dangerous stillness from the corridor. Something different from both. Something she didn't have a category for yet. "You risked your life," he said. "If she'd reached that bed before I came through the door, then your mother would be dead and I would be the only person in the room with an unlabeled substance," Elizabeth said. "I know. I calculated it." She picked up her bag. "The timing was yours to hold. I trusted you to hold it." The words settled between them with a weight neither of them commented on. "Rest," Elizabeth said. "I'll be back before the household wakes." She left him sitting in the chair beside his mother's bed. One hand resting near but not touching the older woman's, watching her breathe in the particular manner of someone who had nearly lost something and was not yet ready to look away from it. Madame Kong woke at 9:30 the following morning. Not gradually. Not with the confused fragility of someone surfacing from long illness. But with a sudden, decisive alertness that made the attending nurse take an involuntary step backward. Her eyes opened, focused, and went directly to Elizabeth, who was standing at the window with a bowl of broth, as though she had known exactly who to look for. "You," Madame Kong said. Her voice was rough with disuse, but it carried. "Me," Elizabeth said. She brought the broth to the bedside. "Drink this slowly." Madame Kong drank. She looked at her own hands. She looked at the room with the systematic attention of a woman recalibrating her understanding of recent events. Then she looked at her son, who had not left his chair. "Ji-hai," she said. "Gone," Min-jun said. "She won't return." Madame Kong absorbed this with the same economy she applied to everything. "The will. Already with the lawyers." A silence. "Then, how long was I?" "For weeks of poisoning," Elizabeth said. 5 days of active crisis. You've been recovering for 3 days, though you weren't awake for most of it." Madame Kong turned and looked at Elizabeth with the full, unobstructed attention that had once made rooms full of dangerous men hold their breath. Elizabeth met her eyes and didn't look away. "My son tells me you're a maid," Madame Kong said. "I am a maid. He also tells me you are your grandmother's granddaughter." "That too." "And that you identified a poison no medical professional detected, administered a treatment with no institutional approval, constructed a forensic trap for a woman who wanted you arrested, and did all of this between your scheduled duties, without telling anyone who didn't need to know." "Yes," Elizabeth said. Madame Kong looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached out and took Elizabeth's hand, not gently, not tentatively, but with the decisive grip of a woman making a declaration. She turned Elizabeth's hand palm up and held it the way you hold something you have decided belongs to you. Then she looked at her son. Min-jun, who had inherited his mother's capacity for stillness and almost nothing of her willingness to show what moved beneath it, was looking at Elizabeth's hand in his mother's with an expression he hadn't bothered to compose. This estate, Madame Kong said, has been protected for 30 years by force and fear and the kind of loyalty you buy with money and risk. That is one kind of strength. Her thumb pressed against Elizabeth's knuckles. What this woman did in 5 days, with dried roots and a tin box, is another kind. She looked at her son, Minjun. He met her eyes. This house needs what she carries, his mother said. And I think you already know it. She placed Elizabeth's hand in her son's with the calm finality of a woman who had survived a murder attempt and emerged from it with absolute clarity about what mattered. Don't be slow about it. I have a will to rewrite, and I'd like to know what name to put in it. Elizabeth looked at her own hand, held in Minjun's, and felt the particular disorientation of a situation that had moved past every boundary she had drawn around it. Minjun looked at her with something that had been building since the kitchen and had now, apparently, stopped waiting for permission. I have questions, Elizabeth said. So do I, he said. I haven't agreed to anything. No, he said. You haven't. Behind them, Madame Kong made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but had all the same properties. She reached for the broth, took a long sip, and looked out at the Seoul skyline with the expression of a woman who had rearranged things to her satisfaction. The city pressed against the windows, indifferent and enormous. In the bed, the matriarch of the Kang family drank her medicine and said nothing more, because some things, she had learned, resolved better when you gave them the room to do it themselves.